The first part of the introduction to philosophy in A102 is on utilitarianism. In the early 19th century, utilitarianism became a controversial philosophy. But in spite of its difficulties, it's become, and perhaps remains, a highly influential way of thinking about moral questions. Today, it has its critics and its defenders. And one of its leading critics is Professor Bernard Williams, Provost of King's College, Cambridge. We're very grateful to Bernard Williams for agreeing to come and give us his views on utilitarianism.
The people who formulated utilitarianism in the 19th century, who Stuart referred to, such as Jeremy Bentham, put the doctrine in a very simple form that the criterion of what we ought to do is simply that which produces the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, this philosophy has had, I think, a checkered history since then. In some ways, it's now even more popular than it was in the Victorian era. I suppose because of the decline of religious belief, for one thing, and the departure of certain old received standards. It satisfies the search for a kind of rational basis of morality which people can understand and, as they hope, apply. But at the same time, though it has that kind of wind behind it, it's also, I think, met with a lot of distrust. Now, some of that distrust is due to the fact that, in a way, it isn't really put into practice. When people say they're putting it into practice, of course, and say they're appealing to the greatest happiness of the greatest number, that often isn't what they're doing. They're often simply putting in a system which appeals to the greatest happiness of a rather few number of people, namely the ones who are running society or doing well out of it. And I think that was some of the criticism, for instance, that Dickens was making through the character of Gradgrind. But I think a lot of the worries about it are that even if you did put it into practice, it'd be a pretty alarming system. That the idea of having society run in this efficient way to produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number might in fact lead to a kind of oppression or paternalism. There is something to be worried about here. People are disquieted about the utilitarian approach, yet at the same time I think a lot of people feel that it's somehow the only rational way that we can have of grounding public morality, perhaps even our private moral sentiments, in the modern world. And as I say, at the same time, they're worried about it. Well, I think we ought to try and see what reasons are going for it, and also what sort of reasons there are for feeling a disquiet or anxiety about it. Now, one of the claims that utilitarianism has always made is that it's a kind of definite scientific system, that traditional systems of values or appeal to virtues or duties or whatever are somehow vague or unsatisfactory or don't lead to a determinate result. And the great virtue of utilitarianism is supposed to be that it does give you a definite result. Well, one question we have to ask is, does it? Now, the slogan was, you remember, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. At least that was the original slogan. Now, one of the things we have to ask is, what's happiness? What counts as happiness for these purposes? Now, for Jeremy Bentham and the early utilitarians, such as James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, to some extent for John Stuart Mill himself, happiness meant pleasure and the absence of pain. But if it strictly means pleasure, simply nothing but pleasure, then it's very doubtful that most people think that the maximization of pleasure, having as much pleasure as possible all around the place, is the aim of human life. It isn't even, I think, what most of us want for ourselves. Suppose somebody invented the hedon machine. The hedon machine, you can imagine, is something with a hairdryer attached to it, such that if you plug yourself into it, you put your head inside this thing and connect it to the mains, it fills you with delicious and variegated sensations forever. You lie there in this machine, totally zonked out, while delicious experiences race through you. Now, if you were given the choice of this, would you want to join yourself up to it? Now, it seems to me an awful lot of people would say, no, that is not a life for a human being. Now, I don't believe that's because they somehow think, you know, duties would be neglected. Indeed, at the end, there wouldn't even be anybody to provide the power to run the machine. I mean, that's a relevant consideration. But we're not asking that. We're not asking that. We're asking, would you want it for yourself? And I think most people, at least quite a lot of people, would say they wouldn't want it for themselves. That's not their view of what a human life should be. And I think we should bear that fact in mind. Well, nowadays, people don't talk so much in terms of pleasure for utilitarianism or even happiness. They talk more in terms of utility or welfare, to use the economist's terms. Well, what do they mean by this? Well, sometimes they simply mean what people choose, what people, given the chance, choose. This is what the economists call revealed preferences, and they say that what the aim of social or moral theory should be is to give people as much of what they want in those terms, in terms of revealed preferences. But of course we all know that what you choose may not be what you really want. That's a very familiar factor. In fact, a great deal of the time people are always choosing things they don't really most want. One reason for this, the simplest reason, is that they suffer from factual error. They choose some, for instance, patent medicine, and they choose it all right, but they don't, in the end, really want it because they falsely believe that it's going to do them some good. In fact, it's no use at all. Well, somebody might say, is what we really want what we would enjoy if we got it? Is it enough to say that if we'd enjoy it, if we got it, that means that's what we basically or really want? Well, surely not. Consider the old pleasure machine again, which I just referred to, the hedon machine. If you plugged yourself into it, if you did that, you'd be frightfully satisfied. If they sent a message in to your doped state and said, how do you like it? You'd say, wonderful, wonderful, it's absolutely marvellous. They say, do you want to go out and do something else? Work for politics, listen to concerts? Oh, no, it's wonderful in here, thank you. Would that tell you that that's what they really wanted? No, of course it wouldn't. Because you know it's an effect of being in this state that it makes you like it. Another example of that is brainwashing. Young people often get caught up in sometimes get caught up in religious groups or some sort of extreme group which take them over, give them some tremendous psychological treatment, after which they say, we want nothing better than to belong to this group. But people, their parents for instance, don't think that proves that's what they really want. They say they've been made to want it by belonging to it. And if you've been made to want it by belonging to it, that doesn't prove that it's what you really or most basically want. Well, there's a lot of notions here. There's the notion, for instance, of what you choose, revealed preference, what you want, what you would want if you were better informed, what would make you better off, what's in your interests, and last of all, perhaps, what suits your needs. Now, all of these are notions we use when we're thinking about ideas like happiness. It's very important which of these sorts of notions utilitarianism, which is just interested in increasing happiness, really wants to adopt. And in fact, I think historically there have always been two strains in utilitarianism, and there still are. There's what might be called the hard-headed factual strain, which says, doesn't matter about all this fancy stuff about interests or needs or what people really want, we'll just give people what they actually prefer. Let's just stick to the facts. That's the utilitarianism of social surveys, consumer research, just going by what people say, away with all these manipulative and so on ideologies. They say that's what you might call the hard-headed factual strain in it. The other strain in it is that really the utilitarian administrators knows what's best for people. They've got an idea of what it would be like, of what people would want if they were better informed and free from confusion. And that sort of utilitarian tends to correct people's preferences. It says we won't just take them as they're expressed in choice or preference. What we'll do is from social science or other sources work out what's best for people. And that tends to lead to a kind of paternalistic management of society, on the other hand. Now, we'll come back to that. There are two political strains in utilitarianism. One is a kind of consumer democracy. The other is a kind of paternalist management. and they jostle with each other. One goes into focus when the other comes into focus when the other goes out, and that's because they play with the concept of happiness between these two extremes a lot of the time. What we've got to realise is there's more than one concept of happiness here. Well, I said there were quite a lot of problems even in the old formula, so there's some problems in the term happiness in the formula, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, one of the other classical sorts of problem concerns what's meant by the greatest happiness of the greatest number. What is it to maximise happiness? What does it come to that, even to increase it? Well, we have one fairly simple criterion, which is sometimes used, and as far as it goes, it's not bad. You've made things better if you've made some people better off and nobody worse off. Well, if you can produce a situation in which you've made some people better off and nobody worse off, you're doing quite well. But of course, in most social situations, that isn't as easy as that. When you make some people better off, you make some other people worse off, almost always. And so what utilitarianism, or any calculations of welfare and utility, are stuck with is trying to think about how you, as it were, lay off the increase for some people against the loss for other people. For instance, am I going to be so much more advantaged by getting these books to read as compared with the loss to somebody who has to pay taxes to support the universities or something of that kind and perhaps cannot buy so much food for their children? How do we compare these kinds of welfare calculations? This has always been a great problem for this kind of thought. Now, the utilitarians will say, quite rightly, that this is a problem for everyone. Everyone has to take this sort of thing into calculation if they're going to think about these things sensibly. And they're right, they're right. Everybody, these difficulties are to some extent difficulties for everybody. The peculiarity of utilitarianism is that it tries to think about these things simply by using the notions of welfare, that is, utility, preference, happiness, whatever those notions are I talked about, and maximising. They're the only notions they want to use. And the fact is that using these two very difficult notions by themselves, in my view, just makes everything harder than it would be if you helped yourself to a rather wider range of notions. Now, there's some more problems that utilitarianism runs into. And I'll mention a couple of them quite briefly here. One is, as I've already implied really, because utilitarianism only adds up and compares welfare, it doesn't have any special place for the kinds of preference which we might call a need. Some of our preferences, we in our ordinary thought, think of as being more basic than others. People's preferences for basic housing, for having a family they can keep together, for food, for a decent measure of privacy. We feel in a way are so basic that we call them human needs. Now, our notion of needs is relative. Nobody will deny that. It's relative to the kind of society, the degree of development, the kind of economic development the society shows. What's a necessity in one place is perhaps not a necessity in another place, and so on. But we have this category. Because we have this category, some of us think that it's more important to meet these basic needs before you go on to meet other things that are mere preferences. Utilitarianism doesn't, at its basic level, care about that. It simply says they're all preferences. If there's enough preferences of the other sort, if there's enough people who've got preferences of the other sort, that will outweigh the needs of a small group of people. You've just got to add up and put in the severity. I think some people think that needs has a kind of moral claim over mere preferences. And that's one notion which utilitarianism finds it very, very difficult to represent in its thinking. The second sort of difficulty which has always plagued them is the question of what might be called second-order preferences, preferences about other people's preferences. For instance, I've just said, and I'm sure a lot of people agree with me, I don't know whether you agree with me, but a lot of people would agree with me, that needs ought to be given priority, that they count more than just ordinary preferences. That has various political consequences. I think that, perhaps because I have certain moral or political views, which make me in favour of satisfying people's needs. Some people have them just through kind of sympathy, that is, they feel identified with the needs of people who are in want. Now, So we perhaps have these second-order preferences to the effect that these other people's needs ought to be met. Does the utilitarian count them or not? Does he count second-order preferences? And that's quite a nitty question. If he does count them, of course, that gets his position nearer to everybody else's position, because he can then put in the preference for needs as one of the items in the mix. But I wonder if he should. For one thing, he's almost doing a kind of double counting. He's counting the people with the needs preference first, then he's counting our sympathetic preference for those people again. So, as it were, those need people come in twice into the sum. I think that these considerations show that, in a way, utilitarianism, as I suggested at the beginning, is very ambiguously related to democracy. On the one hand, it's got a rather democratic element in it. Bentham said each person was to count as one and only one. And that means that built into it is a kind of equality. It meant he certainly was opposed to sort of vested rights of the aristocracy or vested rights of a privileged class in that sense. I mean, he was, in that sense, it was a contribution to modern social thought. But of course that remark, that they're going to count as one and only one, is a remark about how they're going to be counted, not who's going to do the counting. And at the same time, Bentham and the early utilitarians and many of their followers really think in terms of things like central agencies to put all these preferences together, an enormous amount of information about people's preferences and social science applied to their dispositions and so on. And this means that somewhere in the middle there is going to be a system for adding the preferences together in some way or other, which certainly won't give everyone what he or she wants. And of course, if we have the bit which I mentioned before about not simply giving preferences as they are given, but improving them, then of course this central agency is going to be pretty paternalistic as well. So in one way, it is a bit democratic, but I think that the democratic strain, it's confined simply to majoritarianism. It's simply that it involves adding up as large a coincidence of preferences as well. If you think that democracy's got something to do with self-government, for instance, still more, if you think it's got something to do with minority rights, then utilitarianism isn't the philosophy for you. It's actually more concerned with efficient management of majority preferences than it is with self-government or the representation of minority rights, which it's not particularly good at. Well, now, granted that utilitarianism has all these difficulties, which I've mentioned, and there are many more, of course, which have been much discussed in the years since it was first formulated, why does it have the appeal that it does? Well, I think one thing we have to say, just in passing, is it's important that it isn't a religious or transcendental philosophy. It's a secular philosophy. It's very firmly this worldly, and I think that's a requirement which many people make of a philosophy for a modern state. In fact, it's a requirement that a lot of religious people make of the philosophy for a modern state. A lot of religious people don't think that the public philosophy of our society should be itself religious. They think that religion is a very proper thing in its own sphere, but as it were, we are having a pluralist and secular state where you can't build in religious principles into the foundation of things. So, of course, a secular philosophy is desirable. Another thing is that it's one way of interpreting the idea of a pluralist society where people have very different and manifold opinions of various kinds. One thing about utilitarianism is that it seems to be a kind of minimum commitment philosophy. It seems to be just based on one thing we can all agree about, which is making people happier. The trouble is that it isn't as simple as that. When we think about questions, we have a plurality of moral questions, we have a plurality of reasons, a lot of different reasons. In private, we think in terms of duties or virtues or what makes somebody a decent person. In public, we think in terms of such things of preserving the environment or thinking about endangered species or about social justice, which are not obviously utilitarian ideas, all of them. And general happiness is one notion we use among others. But once we have to start talking in public to rationalise our decisions and explain them to everybody, then of course we looks as if we want a common currency within which various claims and various ideas can be compared. And utility looks like the one common currency we can all agree on. That's why it is an important system. It seems to meet this need in a modern society. But of course, if it's important in that sense, so are the objections to it. And we've got to remember that the criticism I made at the beginning, that first, we don't actually agree that some very simple notion of preference maximisation is the one thing that matters. We think very much in terms of interests and needs and justice and a range of notions which aren't simply utilitarian preference maximisation. So it isn't simply true that we all agree on this notion of maximising happiness in this simple sense. Moreover, we don't all agree that the claims or rights of minorities simply don't count in order to add into maximum preference satisfaction. We sometimes think that we don't care a damn about increasing the satisfaction of the majority of people if it involves sacrificing the legitimate rights of some group. We have notions of defensible, justifiable rights of a minority. And this is one of the ideas we have too. It's no good saying, even because we disagree about what those are, we've all got to fall back on this one notion of preference maximisation, because it's the one currency we can all get our hands on. On the addition factor again, it's a lot of this stuff about adding up preferences, adding up happiness so as to maximise it, are actually, when you come to look at it, a fair degree of bluff. And when people try to do it on a social scale, they're not really doing that. They're taking a lot of things for granted. They are actually using a lot of familiar values when they come to these situations and, as it were, pretending to do a sum or kidding themselves that they're doing a sum when they're not really doing that. It's wrong to think of the way in which we take the various claims we use in political or social thought together, to think of that as just a calculative or addition process. It can never be that. It's always going to be a political process. It's going to be a process that's going to involve putting some claims against others and recognising at the end of the line there may be some judgments of priority or importance which we cannot totally rationalise. Now, I don't think when we talk about utilitarianism that we should think of it as if we were discussing simply the timeless truth of some moral system, as if it was somehow written in the galaxy what the true moral system was and we are trying to find out what that truth is. I think what we're trying to do, we're all trying to do, utilitarians included, is to arrive at the most sensible judgment of a public morality to suit the peculiar needs of a modern society. The modern society is very complex. It has many different opinions in it. It also has a quite peculiar demand to understand what it's doing. It's a very great mark of modern societies, that they want to try to understand what they're up to. They're not content with mystification or mere myths or obscurity anymore. Utilitarianism tried to meet that demand. It is an attempt at the public morality for a modern society. And it has an honourable history as trying to meet that demand. But my own belief is that it never can meet it, because in the end it has too few ideas to meet our needs. It only has the one ambiguous idea of welfare, or happiness, and the one inoperable idea of maximisation. Those are its ideas. I think we need more ideas than that. We need as many ideas as we can lay our hands on, and I don't think we want them as tied up with ideals of quantification and trying to add things together, as utilitarianism always has been.